Okay, we only have a few minutes left, but that's fine because last time we weren't able to finish our lesson. And so this is actually part B of New Calvinism that we looked at last time. So I'd like to start with something on the more humorous side since we have a little bit more time. Approximately 1 out of every 4 Christians will encounter adult onset Calvinism, also called AOC, during their life, either personally or in someone close to them. It can be a scary thing to encounter, especially if you're not familiar with the symptoms. The person you once knew and loved is suddenly a completely different person. Don't panic, it gets better. To help you navigate the treacherous waters of AOC, I've listed possible symptoms you may encounter. A sudden urge to correct everything and everyone all the time about every single thing. A growing conviction that every worship song you've sung is heretical and should be excised from the church liturgy. A strange and inexplicable ability to listen to 300 John Piper sermons in a single day. A burning passion to convert everyone, especially your extremely godly parents who taught you the Bible, to Calvinism. A growing level of arrogance that is directly inverse to the number of blog posts you write about humility. Constant cravings for cigars. Deep suspicion of anything that might cause the slightest bit of emotion in church, especially those awful worship songs noted above. Deep-seated cynicism toward anyone who doesn't take a hard stance on an issue, including but not limited to free will, Calvinism, sports, coffee, the Trinity, capitalism, child schooling, and dating. The ability to bring every conversation full circle to Romans 9. Inevitably arriving at the conclusion that John Calvin was not that strong of a Calvinist, at least not as strong as you are. If you or someone you know begins experiencing these symptoms, go to a pastor immediately. It won't make the slightest bit of difference because you are predestined to be a Calvinist, but still you should probably see a pastor. Don't worry, after 5 or 6 years, these symptoms will subside and you or your loved one will return to being a mostly normal person. So, a little fun for you from Stephen Altrogi, if you know him. All right, so we're talking about New Calvinism. We weren't able to finish up last time. But this is important. Last time we learned because so many of our influences and even friends have been influenced by New Calvinist theology. Not every New Calvinist is bad, but neither is every New Calvinist good. Not every quality is worth imitating. For instance, we looked previously at C.J. Mahaney, and there was some debate concerning his leadership due to sexual abuse that happened under his watch, or his protege, Josh Harris, who was once the pastor of that same church that C.J. once pastored, but now he has apostatized entirely. Or there's Mark Driscoll, who is probably what you would consider to be a bully pastor. And those types of characteristics we don't want to emulate. Nevertheless, they are influential. So we're going to talk now about what groups there are or institutions there are, then the similarities and differences between what we would call ourselves Reformed, aka Old Calvinists, similarities and differences, and how we should respond. So you've probably heard of Together for the Gospel. Who's heard of Together for the Gospel? Okay, conference that lasted from 2006 to 2022, if I remember right. Happened every 2 years. Its founders were Ligon Duncan, C.J. Mahaney, Al Mohler, and Mark Dever. It was not an association or fellowship. It was just a conference that you could attend every 2 years. Nevertheless, it was influential. The albums, by the way, Together for the Gospel Live, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, are really good congregational singing albums if you want to listen to some good Christian congregational singing albums that are not like the heretical worship songs that we joked about a moment ago. Then there's the other institution, which we've already talked about a little bit, the Gospel Coalition, affiliated with D.A. Carson, the late Tim Keller, and Kevin DeYoung. And that really was an association. I wouldn't call it a denomination, like, say, the American Baptists or even the Southern Baptist Convention. nevertheless, it is some sort of group together. Our church is very loosely affiliated with that. They have a chapter located out of Dayton, and basically all it is a directory for people who want to look up Gospel Coalition churches, and our name is on that list. But other than that, we don't really have any connection with them, properly speaking. 9 Marks, it's not an association, it's a parachurch group, but they focus on promoting church health. I'm sure you're familiar with Mark Dever, its founder. Jonathan Lehman is their editor and lead writer, and lots of good stuff out from them. I've really appreciated their ministry over the decades. Desiring God, founded by John Piper and his church where he pastored, Bethlehem Baptist Church in Minneapolis. I was just reading something else this past week, and I sent it on to Alex because it was pertinent for what he's going to teach coming up soon, and how Piper really is so influential in our circles, and really lots of different circles. Anything that's remotely Calvinistic has been influenced by him. For instance, I introduced myself to a church one time, and I said, yeah, I just got back from Together for the Gospel, and they were like, what's that? And I said, well, you might know its speakers, and I said John MacArthur, who they'd never heard of, and Mark Dever, they'd never heard of, but I said John Piper, and they're like, oh yeah, we know John Piper. So lots of people have known John Piper. Similarly, the Passion conferences in Atlanta, I don't know if they're still going on. Does anybody know if they're still going on? I'm not sure. Very popular. There were like 20,000 people that are attending these youth conferences down in Atlanta, and Piper was the keynote speaker. I think that may have been where he preached his famous seashell sermon. Is that right? Okay. And then Sovereign Grace Ministries connected with C.J. Mahaney and Bob Coughlin. They're what you might call charismatic Calvinists. So they believe in the continuation of spiritual gifts, including prophecy and tongues, and maybe, I think they even, at least at one point, they had apostles in their denomination. I'm not sure if they still do. Mahaney would, okay. So that came out of the third wave of the charismatic movement, but we won't get into all that. Then there's Southern Baptist Seminary, located just 2 hours down the interstate from us, and that's influential in lots of different ways, both in its conservative theology, but also its Calvinistic moorings, when Al Mohler brought it back to Calvinistic and conservative theology in the early 90s. And then there's a publisher that's actually been very influential as well, and it's not Banner of Truth. There's another publisher that's been just as influential in the lives of new Calvinists. What book publisher could that be? Crossway, without a doubt. They took the RSV, which was a Bible translation from the 50s and 70s, that was more of a mainline denomination, a revision itself of the American Standard Version, the ASV of 1901, and they took it to become, they modernized it just a hair to become the ESV, English Standard Version, in 2001. And it is by far the most popular English Bible translation today among Calvinists. Even in our circles, ESV would without a doubt be the most popular. You gonna say something? No? Just a head itch? Got it. All right, so now let's ask these two questions. How are New Calvinists similar to Old Calvinists? And how are New Calvinists different than Old Calvinists? And I'm calling us Old Calvinists. So similarities. We are similar in our Calvinistic approach to soteriology. And I don't love using that word Calvinist because it sounds like we're following a particular person, but you all know what I mean. That God is sovereign in our election, our predestination, our salvation. There are not a lot of Arminians or free will type believers, easy believism type people present in this movement. We're also similar in that we are appreciative of our Reformed heritage. People appreciate Jonathan Edwards and John Owen and the Puritans and the Reformers like John Knox and so forth. And they even not only appreciate that Reformed heritage, but also love the theology of those types of people. They appreciate the Jonathan Edwards' theology and books by Banner of Truth and other Puritans. And then lastly, but not leastly, they preach the gospel of Jesus Christ clearly and unapologetically. There's no hint of liberalism or modernism, as it was once called, in New Calvinism. Occasionally you'll have some sort of accommodationism where you'll see some New Calvinist speaker speaking at an event where you have some heretics, and it kind of blows your mind, like, why would that person be speaking there? But that's usually not very common. It's usually very clear and unapologetic in the gospel in both its first layer of preaching, but also its associations and connections. But what about the differences? What are some differences between New Calvinists and Old Calvinists? What do you guys think? What are some differences between New Calvinists and Old Calvinists like us?
New Calvinists are cool.
Okay?
Yeah.
I'm cool. Come on. Ethan, why are you laughing? Unbelievable. Disrespect right there. Okay, they're cool. It's trendy to be a New Calvinist, not as trendy to be a Reformed Baptist network type of church.
New Calvinists generally hold to the regular principle?
Usually, but not entirely. Alex, you seem to have a perspective.
Well, Mark Driscoll, who was probably the biggest face of the YRR,
I guess that's why I'm asking.
he specifically wrote a book against.
Okay.
There would be a few in the YRR who do, Kevin DeYoung, Lillian Duncan,
Yeah.
Mark Dever,
Mhm.
but you'll notice that those are, besides Kevin DeYoung, those are older heads, and they're not the majority in the
Okay. What other people are you thinking of that would,
well,
besides Driscoll?
Driscoll, Chandler, Platt, Mahaney.
Okay. What elements of worship do you think that they would include that we don't think are biblically permissible?
So that is a good question, because a lot of times, along with the Sabbath day, which I'm sure we'll talk about again, they will deny the law of the regular principle or deny the law of the Sabbath day while fulfilling it. They just don't like the principle.
They like the historicity of it, not the biblicity of it.
But there are some YRR churches that are famous for having like ballerinas on stage and
Yeah.
stormtroopers.
There's some Reformed churches that would do that?
I
Wow.
believe the stormtrooper thing was Tim Keller's church. Yeah.
Oh my. All right, other differences you have noticed or seen with Old Calvinism versus New Calvinism?
Confessionalism.
That was what I was going to hit next. Yep. They're not often confessional in really any sense. Some of them are, like your Southern Baptist churches would have the Baptist Faith and Message, which admittedly is way shorter than ours, but at least it's something, and it's a decent confession of faith. But a lot of churches are just kind of like, yeah, this is our general statement of faith, and we try to look at it every once in a while. They're not trying to abide by their confession of faith as their bounds. They're often not covenantal in their theology. Sometimes they're quasi-dispensational, for those of you who know what that term means, but oftentimes they just have never thought about the covenant theological aspect to the Bible. We're different in that in our circles, you will very rarely come across a continuationist, a charismatic, whereas we would be, that they would be definitely for the charismatic gifts. People would say that they are open but cautious when it comes to spiritual gifts, and we would say that while God can do miraculous things, he has not gifted his church with gifts like tongues and prophecy and apostles and so forth. And regular principle, he already mentioned. Sabbath was also on my list of things. Sabbath is not a very common thing to hold in New Calvinism. Now, I need a little clarification in there, is that people like Tom Wells, our founding pastor, and D.A. Carson, they've thought very carefully about the Sabbath day, New Covenant theology, and they would land in a different place. I appreciate the fact that they have thought through these things and written out documents and books on the subject, even if I disagree with their conclusions. But I would think that most people just don't, in the YRR, Young Restless Reform Movement, just don't even think about the Lord's Day and Sabbath. And they are often, to Linda's point, culturally progressive. They aren't just cool, but they're trying to be cool, and they're trying to engage the culture, and they're trying to utilize the culture's music styles. They want to redeem it for themselves which is how you end up with really wonky things in your worship services because regulative principle is out, and when you add cool factor to it, you end up with worship styles that are really flamboyant and flashy. Yep.
What would our view be on the local church? Would we differ as far as that goes? Like,
What aspect of the local?
Yeah.
going to your pastor instead of cool, trendy pastors online. Like,
It's probably a smattering of different answers to that. I mean, if you're in a church like Mark Devers, you're probably going to get a really good answer. Like Matt Chandler's church is huge, so like, would they have that mentality? I don't know. I'm just not familiar enough to know the answer to that question. It's a good one though.
I was going to say, along with that, it's such a diverse movement
Yeah.
that there is no consensus on church polity.
Yep.
Right? You have Presbyterians, you have Baptists, and you have new megachurch multi-site models. They don't the new Calvinists were famous around not unifying around secondary issues, only what the gospel is, and usually a Calvinistic understanding of the gospel.
Yeah. So that's why some of you, I won't include myself in this, enjoy Christian hip hop. Okay? More power to you. Are we going to bring that into our worship service? Probably not anytime soon, because we don't think that that is appropriate for a singing of the Lord's people together. Some could be. I think there's probably some songs that could be, but it would not be as easy.
I think the question for music in worship is it suited for congregational singing?
Exactly. And not all of it is. All right, so next, how did this movement of new Calvinists spring up? Mark Dever was asked this question. Here's what he said. Theologically, of course, the answer is because of the sovereignty of God. But I have never been convinced by hyper-Calvinism's argument that because God has determined the ends, the means don't matter. Means do matter. And as a Christian, as a historian who has lived through the very change I was considering, I wondered what factors had been used by God. And so here's some of the means that I've come up with and that Mark mentioned in that interview. C.H. Spurgeon, the epitome of a Reformed Baptist. If you talk to somebody and they have no idea what a Reformed Baptist is, ask them if they've heard of Spurgeon, and that'll give them a good idea as to what a Reformed Baptist is. His sermons, even though Reformed Baptist Church has basically died off, that we looked at already, his sermons continue to be printed, even through the early decades of the 20th century. Another preacher from the 20th century is Martin Lloyd-Jones, who we already looked at, Banner of True Publishers. One that we haven't mentioned yet, but I think still is influential, is the Presbyterian Church in America, PCA. Overall, it's a good denomination. They have some armpit areas that I don't really care for, but overall, it's a decent denomination. Other people like J.I. Packer, who is an Anglican, interestingly, but is a conservative. He wrote Knowing God, a fantastic book if you haven't read that one. Then there's Ethan's favorite theologian, R.C. Sproul, and Ligonier Ministries. Wonderful guy who I didn't really come to appreciate as much as I should have until he had passed away. So that's my shame. I wouldn't call him a new Calvinist, but I think his ministry has influenced new Calvinism. As I already mentioned, John Piper, John MacArthur. There's a systematic theology that's also been influential in new Calvinism. Anybody know who wrote that systematic theology? Wayne Grudem. Now, admittedly, it's a decent volume. He does put the cookies on the bottom shelf. He wants people to understand it, but he takes several positions in there that you and I would disagree with. If I remember, he has some creationism views that are off. He's off on continuationism. I think there's a third one that he was off on as well. Yeah, internal functional subordination. If you don't know what that is, that's fine. Allie?
No.
Oh, I thought that was a hand. Okay. All right, and then the increasing number of Reformed seminaries, of which I am probably a product of. I went to Bob Jones Seminary, which is not specifically a Calvinistic or Reformed institution, and yet I came to know Reformed theology through my professors. And it wouldn't still, to this day, be an explicitly Reformed institution, but I was influenced to some degree by them. Yep?
You were about to explain EFS.
No, I said I'm not going to explain it. Oh, my bad. No.
Okay.
Talk to me about it later. No time for that. It's a good question. Oh, yeah, whole series. And then there's this X factor that didn't exist in decades and centuries prior, and it's called the internet. Yep. And all of a sudden, Paul Washer's YouTube videos can be shared, and John MacArthur's on YouTube, and you got you don't have to share audio cassette tapes anymore and sneak them to one another. Like I'm so old that I remember when 9 Marks interviews and audio lectures were given out on CD. Like that's how old I am. So I know. And now you can just go to their website and download them all. So the internet and YouTube especially has been very influential. So now we got to ask this question, and this really is one we can't skip, and we have to end with this, is how should those of us who are old Calvinists, or what you might call Reformed, respond to this movement? A, we could just spurn them because they're not Reformed enough. And that's what a lot of people do. I know you just kind of raise your glasses up at your face, and you would never see in many of our circles a new Calvinist be invited to preach at one of our conferences. And I see the point of that, but at the same time, I don't mind some of the ecumenism of allowing us to say they are a good, godly man who's preached and lived and pastored faithfully for decades. We don't have to cross every T and dot every I in order to have some sort of a fellowship with them. So that's why, for instance, Reformed Baptist Network several years ago had Mark Dever speak at our General Assembly. Is he a Reformed Baptist, properly speaking? No. But has he been a faithful, godly pastor and Christian man for decades? Yes. B, options about how we should respond. We should just become a new Calvinist and just follow the movement and just do what they do. Well, sometimes the ship is not necessarily going in the same direction that we would want to go, so ship jumping aboard is not always the best idea. And for that matter, we have a little bit more of a track record in our circles with our history. Not everything about Reformed Baptist history is good, as you all well know, but there are many good things that we can cherish and appreciate from our history. So let's utilize what we have and try to build the best we can in our circles using what you might just call Reformed Baptist or Reformed theology in a capital R sense, but not an all caps sense, so that we can best exemplify what the Bible says. And then lastly, I think this is definitely something we should do. Thank God for them and fellowship with them carefully. If you've been around our circles long enough, you know that some Reformed people even throw pot shots at new Calvinists, even like Together for the Gospel. Well, I'm not going Together for the Gospel. They're not Reformed. Well, here's what Ian Murray, the historian himself, the old man who's like 90 years old now, he said this in 2014. He went to it at Mark Dever or someone's invite. The concluding note must be of thanksgiving. There is a wonderful reviving power in the Word of God. Prayer is being heard and a new generation is rising. And then he quotes from Scripture, "Let thy work appear unto thy servants and thy glory unto their children." So let's take Murray's example and pray that God would continue to reform his church, that we would be maturing Reformed Christians, and that we ourselves would be reformed and in our circles, and that God would keep us from being cocky, that we are not like these unconfessional, non-Sabbatarian new Calvinists, but that we would be humble in our approach to God's Word and what He has given us. Next time, Alex is going to teach a lesson on Southern Seminary and how that has been influential in the Reformed and New Calvinist circles. Not because I love everything about Southern Seminary. I don't love everything about Southern Seminary, nor Al Mohler for that reason. But nevertheless, it is something really unique that has happened at that institution that hasn't happened really elsewhere in history. It's a historical phenomenon. And so it's really cool to highlight something that God has done there. Questions or comments about today's lesson or last week's lesson? Yep.
You said, I'm not aware of this, so I'm genuinely asking. Mark Devers, you wouldn't consider him Reformed, like Reformed Baptist?
He would be, here's my little fake way of defining it. There's like your huge head, proud, arrogant Reformed Baptist, and that's all caps Reformed Baptist. And then there's Reformed Baptist, capital R, capital B, like we are. We're confessional, traditional Reformed Baptist. But then yours are like your lowercase r, your lowercase b Reformed Baptist, and I would put Mark Dever in that category.
This makes sense.
That doesn't make a lot of sense.
I think my church in Columbus would be,
Yeah.
In lowercase r.
if not the lowercase,
Yeah.
like the shadow of the lowercase.
The shadow of the lowercase, yeah.
Comic Sans
So-
version. Yes, yes.
So Capitol Hill uses the New Hampshire, right?
It's modified, but yeah.
Oh, they use a modified.
Last I heard, yeah.
But he himself, I heard, would subscribe to the Second London, but doesn't think it's appropriate for a church to subscribe.
Yes, but I've heard him say some things about continuationism that go against what our confession would say. So I still think it's a great
Yeah.
model of a pastor and theologian, and I would have some quibbles here and there, but I'm not sure I would call him Reformed Baptist. He would call himself a fundamentalist, which is
Yeah.
pretty interesting.
Yeah.
He means that in the historical term. Yeah, he means it in the historical sense, not the cultural connotation sense. Other questions or comments? We're reaching the end of the series. I thought I had figured out what we're going to do next for Sunday school, but I may have changed my mind. So I'm not going to tell you what it is because I might change my mind again. So you're dismissed.
See you next week.
Darrell Roundtree, First Baptist Church, Fayetteville.